Hello, everyone. Hello. Everyone is having a good time. They want us. Welcome. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. It's so nice to see a lot of new faces today. And it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Anzali, who has been here in Princeton for a year and as a fellow at Iran Center for this current semester, and doesn't feel like we have a guest today. He's one of the hosts, basically. And it's been a pleasure to have him around. Professor Anzali is an associate professor of religion at Middlebury College. He received his PhD from the Department of Religious Studies at Rice University. Prior to that, he studied at the Qom Seminary, focusing on Islamic rational disciplines, including speculative mysticism, irfan, and philosophy. He also received, he also has an engineering background with, like all other good scholars from Iran. He also received a master's degree in Islamic philosophy and theology from Tehran University. He has had an enduring interest in mystical tradition of Islam. He's also interested in intellectual and social histories of modern Iran, religion and religious thought. His first monograph, Mysticism in Iran, the Safavid Roots of Modern Concept, brings these interests together in an in-depth examination of the emergence of the category of irfan as an alternative to tasawwuf during the Safavid era. He is currently working on a research project that focuses on the famed Iranian theologian Morteza Motahhari and his significance. And today's talk is based on this current research. I'm one of the reasons, and I was looking forward to having Professor Anzali here, is that Motahhari, I think, is one of the sort of less talked about theologians in Iran, while he had a significant influence in the formation of new religious intellectuals in Iran. Please help me to welcome Professor Anzali.
Thank you, Behruz, for that generous introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'd especially like to thank my friends who are celebrating the Eid today. I know it's a busy day, and I appreciate especially those who've been celebrating this morning who made it here. So extra thanks to them, but I'm grateful for everyone for being here, and I hope to make it worthwhile. It does actually feel like I have some home field advantage, kind of so many familiar faces since I've been coming here to these seminars since fall. So it doesn't feel like I'm talking in a kind of different institution. So you would think I've spent the last few days like relentlessly kind of spending time preparing for this talk, but I've actually been doing nothing like that. Some of you know that I traveled to northern Vermont to visit to see the total solar eclipse. So that was like what was on my mind in the past few days. I actually, if this works, I have some photos of it to show you. Yeah? That's it. So I just put together some photos that I took. As you can see, I mean, it was much more dramatic with your naked eye than you see here. But anyway, so the other point I wanted to make, and I'm not going to let the eclipse go, right, is that there is a eclipse in 10 years that's going to go through Iran. At the time, if you're in Iran, you can go to Shiraz, go to Pasargad. The path of totality is going to go right smack in the middle of, like Pasargad, and it's going to be right after Sal Tahvil, which is like CS fan, like just a couple of hours after Sal Tahvil, 2034. So if you can go to Iran, that's the place to be. I don't know if there's kind of any miracle is going to happen at it, but it's interesting coincidence of a lot of factors.
We've already learned a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so enough of the eclipse, and now maybe a little bit about Morteza Motahhari. So Motahhari was born in the village of Fariman in northwest Iran in 1920, right before the establishment of the Pahlavi dynasty, and was assassinated in 1979, just a few months after the Saud dynasty was toppled in a popular revolution led by Khomeini. After completing the elementary levels of madrasa learning in Mashhad, he moved to Qom in 1937 to pursue advanced studies. He stayed there for 15 years, receiving extensive training in Islamic jurisprudence and philosophy. He had several prominent teachers in Qom, among them Ayatollah Khomeini, of course. He initially attended Khomeini's public sermons on spirituality and ethics, Dars Akhlaq, and later his jurisprudence and philosophy lessons. Learning philosophy had a deep impact on him. In his own words, I remember when I was studying Qom, one day I was examining myself, my studies, and this direction which I had chosen for life. I asked myself whether it might not have been better for me to pursue a branch of modern Western education instead of the seminary education. In those days, I had just become familiar with Islamic philosophy. The pleasure of those days, especially the depth, nuance, and sweet utterances of my teacher, i.e. Khomeini, is among the unforgettable memories of my life. Mullah Sadra's particular philosophical take had a tremendous impact on me. Learning it made me ecstatic. An essential philosophical design, Tarh Bunyadi, had taken shape in my mind, which was the basis for solving my problems in a comprehensive worldview. It was then that I realized that my material and spiritual well-being might have been the same, or perhaps even better, had I not studied Islamic philosophy and benefited from the graceful presence of this teacher. The only thing that I would have not been able to find anything like this was the intellectual design, Tarh Fikri, and its results. So that was Motahhari himself. Now, in the late 1940s, so Motahhari is in Qom, his relationship with Ayatollah Burujerdi, who at the time was the highest religious authority for the entire Shi'i world, began to sour over perceptions of his tacit support for Fadaiyan Islam at the expense of Burujerdi's leadership. And most of you know Fadaiyan Islam is this militant, radical group led by Nawab Safavi. They did a couple of very high-profile assassinations, including Kasravi's. And Motahhari did have some relationship with Nawab, although it's not very clear how close they were. As a result, he found himself deprived of financial support, and basically his stipend was cut by Burujerdi. Having just married and needing to provide for his family, he had to make a difficult decision to envision his future somewhere else. The decision to move to Tehran in 1952 might have been against his wishes, but in hindsight, only there his extraordinary potential would have come to be realized. It marked the beginning of a profoundly different chapter of his life in which he discovered his extraordinary talent in the world of public scholarship and outreach while making a decent living as a professor of ancient philosophy and theology at the University of Tehran. And then I say ancient philosophy, it's because the title of his professorship was Falsafe Qadim. That's kind of what they call it. All his published work, with the major exception of Usul al-Falsafe, was conceived in Tehran during a quarter century of intense intellectual activity. It's important to note that by disposition, Motahhari lacked revolutionary zeal or an inclination towards political activism himself. He clearly understood his own mission more in intellectual and social rather than political terms. That's not to say, however, that he did not have deep sympathies with the anti-tyrannical and anti-imperialist sentiments of his time. Leading Muslim political activists, including Khomeini and Bazargan, considered him a trusted friend and an ally. It was this trust that led the former, meaning Khomeini, to appoint him to form Shurای Enqilab, or the Council for the Revolution, in 1978 to prepare for the political transition after the expected downfall of the Pahlavi regime. It was perhaps this appointment also that put him on the assassination list of a militant anti-clerical Islamist group called Furqan, who shot him dead on May 1st, 1979. His assassination raised his profile as a martyr for the cause of the revolution. It was Khomeini's strong emotional reaction to the news of his student's death and his full-throated endorsement of Motahhari's writings, however, that catapulted him into a household name in post-revolutionary Iran. And this is kind of a newspaper piece that I got from internet. You can see Khomeini on the left. I mean, if you know anything about this guy, is that he doesn't really cry or smile in public. I mean, there's one major occasion he cries in public. That's the, like Azadari Imam Hussein, or the mourning of Imam Hussein. But other than that, this is the only picture I've seen of him actually crying. So his assassination immediately raised his profile as a martyr for the cause of the revolution. And then, this also began a rapid process in which the nascent regime and its proponents appropriated his image as the so-called theoretician of the Islamic Revolution and promoted his writings as the foundation of revolutionary ideology, a process that has continued until today. This politicization, I believe, has led to a rather distorted view of him in the existing literature, both in Iran and outside it, creating a fundamental confusion about the overall identity and significance of his intellectual project. Perhaps nowhere this confusion is more apparent than in the amazing variety of sometimes contradictory labels scholars and pundits have used to describe him. Some have categorized him as an Islamist, an ideologue of revolutionary Islam, and its political theorist. Another group have tried to portray him as a reform-minded thinker and philosopher, emphasizing modernist aspect of his project. Yet a third group have dismissed him as an overrated, intellectually barren and rigid traditionalist. And I'm not saying that some of these labels don't apply to him, meaning I think there are aspects of his thought that kind of will be fair to say he was an Islamist, but I don't think any of these labels really capture the core of his intellectual project. I'd like to suggest that the core identity of his intellectual project evades all these labels. While it's true that he was a traditional philosopher and jurist by training, his lifelong calling and vocation was that of a mutakallim. Now, what is a mutakallim? So, what does it mean to view Motahhari as a mutakallim, and how does it help us understand his success and significance? To answer these questions, we need to first define what a mutakallim is. The term kalam, of course, is translated often as Islamic theology, but it has a technical meaning that's much narrower. In simplest terms, theology is a reference to discourse about God, in a kind of broadest terms. Depending on which God or gods we are talking about, one may speak of Greek, Christian, Islamic theologies. In contrast, kalam, which literally means discourse, signifies a specific field of Islamic knowledge with long history going back to the Abbasid era. Scholars differ on the best approach to define kalam, but most stakeholders would agree that in broadest of terms, kalam, if you define it in terms of its goal, is a field that, as you can see here, tasked with explaining and defending the Islamic tradition through systematic argumentation and discourse. And the word tradition here is important for me. In most of the traditional, definitions, if you go to original sources, they don't say tradition, of course. The word tradition doesn't exist in that discourse. They say Islamic beliefs like usul aqaid, or they list a series of beliefs. But I think the word tradition actually works better, especially for me analytically, because I feel the field of kalam has a much broader kind of reach. For example, if mas'ale hijab is not like usul aqaid, but it can become a kalami question when there are questions raised about it. So it's not just usul aqaid that kind of are discussed in kalam. Now, I also need to define the word tradition here because analytically I'm going to hang a lot on it. And I borrowed a definition from McIntyre. I'm actually reading Professor Zaman's book, who was like the one that kind of prompted me to think about this definition. McIntyre defines tradition as an argument extended through time in which certain fundamental agreements are defined and redefined in terms of two kinds of conflict, those with critics and enemies external to the tradition who reject all or at least key parts of those fundamental agreements, and those internal interpretive debates through which the meaning and rationale of the fundamental agreements come to be expressed and by whose progress a tradition is constituted. So if you think about this tradition, I have a lot of problems with the definition. It is highly disembodied. It just talks about like this, as if like tradition happens over like the clouds in some kind of ethereal level. And it also does kind of, I think I found it problematic because the boundaries of what is inside tradition and what is outside is very rigid for me. But I'm going to take it as a working definition for now until I can come up with a better one myself for my purposes. So based on this, to defend the tradition, the scholars of Kalam would have to be engaged in two fronts, external and internal. In both, their essential task is an intermediary one, in which they have to render intelligible parts of tradition that have come under pressure or question to a target audience. And this is a really important point I want to emphasize, this intermediary role that the field of Kalam plays. There is defending and explaining to whom, right? There is an audience you have, so you are kind of having this intermediary role between a specific audience that you have to like kind of make this tradition intelligible for them, right? So this is an important aspect of Kalam that, for example, philosophy doesn't really have as much of, in terms of its definition. I'm not saying it's not impacted by the cultural context, but it doesn't, Kalam, as its very definition is like you have to play this intermediary role. Now, traditions can go through long periods of relative stability in which they are not threatened in any significant way by external critique or internal strife. They can also go through periods of intense internal strife and or external threat that shakes them to their core, endangering an epistemological crisis. Because of the intermediary nature of Kalam as a field, its outlook changes dramatically depending on whether we are dealing with a period of stability or a period of crisis. During long periods of stability, we see a historical tendency in the field of Kalam to turn inwards into a scholastic mode in which scholarly activity largely consists of engaging in subtle refinement of previously laid out arguments and getting involved in scholastic hair-splitting with past and present colleagues in the form of commentarial traditions. That's kind of usually what happens when you don't have new questions, right? It's kind of, but then during the period of significant change, Kalam can turn into a highly innovative and agile field in which new interpretations, definitions, and justifications for tradition emerge. For a successful defense of tradition in such a period, a mutakallim needs to possess important skills beyond just deep familiarity with their tradition. It's essential, for example, that they have a good understanding of the nature of the conflict and the discursive fault lines that exist. They also need a deep familiarity with the target audience and ability to speak in their language and understand their mindset. Only with the cultivation of such skills, a mutakallim can successfully and effectively fulfill his or her intermediary function. Yet, if one is positioned to defend the tradition, as a mutakallim is, it's imperative for the above-mentioned efforts to be recognized by insiders as continuations of the said tradition, rather than representing a break with it. And this is an analytically crucial point that I want to make here, because I believe this is exactly what differentiates Motahhari's project when you compare him to modernists, Roshan Fikran Nadini, or when you compare him even to fundamentalists. While both fundamentalists and modernists need to legitimize their claim partially by demonstrating their grounding in the past, they do it much more selectively to the extent that from a historical critical perspective, their efforts are best understood in terms of inventing novel traditions of interpretation, rather than extending the old ones. Therefore, in their effort to offer an interpretation of tradition that's appealing to an audience highly influenced by modernity, they, meaning modernists and fundamentalists, they have much more hermeneutical leeway and much less quote-unquote baggage to deal with. This is like compared to a mutakallim among, coming from the ranks of the ulama, who is committed to the totality of his interpretive tradition. In a world enamored by ideas of change, progress, and innovation, this often leads to a less favorable view and dismissive attitudes towards the ulama, among them, like Motahhari as well, and their interpretive moves as less innovative and less original when compared to modernists or fundamentalists. But I'm going to talk in the rest of this, lecture about like why I don't think that's the case, why some of the innovation or originality is not the only stick yard that we could, measure someone. I think as part of, the part of discourse that Motahhari was, he did pretty significant moves there, and we have to understand those moves in the context, or from the context he was coming from. So I'm going to talk about this context now a little bit to kind of lay out from what context he was coming and in which context he made those contributions. So the period between the late 19th century and the mid-20th century represents a period of epistemological crisis for Shi'i tradition, as represented by the ulama. More relevant to our subject matter today, during the last decade of Reza Shah's reign, when the ideological challenge of Western economic, political, and cultural hegemony was combined with the brute and extensive force of a hostile modern state bureaucracy, the very viability and survival of that tradition was on the line. Motahhari's most formative years of intellectual growth coincided with this period, a time when the threat of annihilation was most acutely felt not only in terms of dwindling resources and numbers, but also substantial and unprecedented critiques of Shi'i tradition by the likes of Kasravi and Hakamizadeh. So I'm just gonna, this is just, I've pulled some information from a variety of sources historically about the number of religious students in Shi'i seminaries in the past, starting from 1928. I didn't have information for every single year that I wanted, but you can see in 1940, 1942, the total number of religious students in Iran, the talaba, this is kind of less than 700, less than 800. Like this is the result of the pressures that Reza Shah put on the resources that they had access to. In a way you can say if this pressure continued for a decade more, we would have not really had any seminary to speak of. And it's only after the end of World War II that you have began, kind of a period of growth for the seminaries. And this is kind of a topic for a different talk, but what happens between 1947 and 1960, this dramatic increase that you see. In a way you can see, like the second Pahlavi's kind of perception that, religious, the seminaries represent an ally in the larger fight to fight communism or whatever led him to basically allow them to grow exponentially after that. But Reza Shah this is like this period between, before the World War II, this is where Motahhari is actually in Qom. And that's kind of like what he sees. And then, of course, you have Kasravi and Hakamizadeh. Most of their radical writings were after Reza Shah, but it's really amazing how single-handedly Kasravi shook the Hawza to its core. They didn't know what to do with his work. Khomeini writes, of course, a Kashf al-Asrar, as a response to Hakamizadeh, but you read Kashf al-Asrar and it's not a good work of Kalam, I would say. It's just a really meandering work of it starts with Shahristani's Milal and Nahad stuff, and it's just very clear that nobody is ready to respond to these critiques. So this is kind of the environment in which really we have to understand Motahhari's emergence. So the tradition that Motahhari was so fond of was under attack from multiple fronts, and he felt the weight of history on himself to do something about it. And he says about this himself, and I quote, "Since I started writing books and articles 20 years ago, that is in 1950, the only thing I have aimed at in all my writings have been to solve problems and answer questions that are posed in our age around Islamic topics. Some of my writings are philosophical, some social, some ethical, some juristic, and some historical. Even though the topic of these writings are totally different from each other, the general goal of all has been the same. The assault of Western colonialism with its visible and invisible agents on the one hand, and the intentional or unintentional shortcomings of many of those who claim to be supporters of Islam in this age on the other, has caused Islamic beliefs in different areas to come under attack. Therefore, I saw it my duty to do something in this arena to the extent of my abilities. I mean, this is basically his way of saying I am a mutakallim based on that definition. But you would be surprised that nobody actually, except for like Reza Davari Ardakani, is the only person in Iran who have talked about Motahhari as a mutakallim. And it has its own reasons. If you want, I can go to it like in Q&A about like why people and why he himself didn't identify as such explicitly. He didn't call. He wanted to be known as a philosopher. He didn't want to be known as a mutakallim, but that's kind of a different story. So Motahhari was convinced that the tradition of learning he was familiar with had more than enough resources to rise to the occasion. It was only the question of whether there was enough courage, insight, and agility to use those resources for building a framework of rational inquiry and discourse about tradition that could measure up to prevalent Western ideologies of the time. Many clerics, of course, shared his conviction that Islam is the best ideology or whatever, but what made Motahhari different was the fact that he not only understood the significance of this intermediate role of kalam, but also had the intellectual courage to fully commit to what it meant to play that role in practice. That is, to engage in a genuine, consistent, and systematic dialogue with the audience he was trying to make the tradition intelligible for. And this is a point I'm trying to make now, like in the rest of the lecture. The theological nature of his kalam, for me, is the most important thing that really distinguishes him from a lot of other people. The fact that a lot of his ideas were really born in the process of a dialogue with people who were, he was trying to convince. Mostly these are, I'm going to talk about his audience in a moment, but that theological nature for me is really important. To fully appreciate this theological nature, we need to take a step back and consider the, how his audience emerged. Motahhari stepped into his role as a public intellectual while the Iranian public was in the final phases of a dramatic transformation. The modern Iranian middle class, which emerged during the 1920s and 30s thanks to the expansion of modern education and the bureaucratic modern state, was firmly in place after World War II. While general literacy rates remained relatively low throughout the 50s and the 60s, below 10% of total population, the new educated middle class, that is people with high school degrees or higher, and who were employed by the government or working as professionals in the private sector, possessed an outsized power relative to their share of population thanks to the sizable cultural and economic capital that came with the modern education. Already in the 1950s, the number of people educated in modern institutions of education, that is secondary education or higher, began to dwarf those educated in traditional maktabs and madrasas. And this is kind of, again, data I've gotten from historical sources. You can see, compared to the growth of madrasa, you have like this enormous growth, like from 1960s to 70s in terms of like university students. So this important social transformation complicated the old and established dichotomy of awam versus khawas. It's kind of the elite versus the public. The binary, of course, was an important discursive tool that helped maintain the social status of the elite, whether they were religious, economic, or political, over the general public. In the case of the ulama, it performed its function through an additional process of sanctification. For if, as Durkheim noted a long time ago, we understand the sacred to mean that which is set apart and forbidden by taboos, then this binary certainly served the ulama well, helping them to extend the sacredness of the tradition and its foundational texts and figures to themselves as its representatives, the ones who donned the mantle of the prophet, so to speak. In this context, it's interesting to consider Reza Shah's efforts to isolate the clerical class and reduce their power. The carefully maintained and socially constructed separation between the ulama and the public was largely irrelevant for the new elite, who lacked the meaningful economic and social ties to the ulama. In addition, the law of uniformity of dress that Reza Shah established, in the last years of his reign, might have actually helped to push the ulama beyond the realm of the sacred to the realm of really social irrelevance. And this is kind of interesting point, meaning like the sacred, no matter what you think about it in a Durkheimian way, it's a social function. You're set apart, but there's still people interacting with you, right? There are rules for interaction. But then like what happens here in Reza Shah with all kind of transformations that are happening, seems like the ulama are kind of pushed like beyond the realm of the sacred to become like really kind of a mystical unknowability. It's kind of like, who are these guys? We don't really have a point of connection to them. They don't have this connection, organic connection to the social fabric, especially what I mean by for the new kind of middle class elite people who are born of the economic transformation. So the results of this transformation were acutely felt by members of the new elite who, while lacking the symbiotic relationship of the old elite, the mercantile class, with the ulama, were intrigued by their claims to religious authority and religious authenticity as faithful subjects. So if you're part of the new elite, and if you're a religious man or woman, you have there's interesting there are those people, the ulama, they have some aura of sacrality, but you don't know how to define, there's no working relationship there. So a good example would be Mahdi Bazargan here. So if you think about his father, who was a traditional merchant with organic relationship with the ulama, Mehdi Bazargan was trained, went through education in Paris, comes back. He doesn't have that same organic relationship with this. And he develops a very good relationship with both Motahhari and Talaqani. And it's not just a political alliance. If you think about, for example, Talaqani or even Motahhari, it's often like this is I believe, even though the likes of Bazargan, they often dismissed the ulama as in general as rigid and look at the interpretation as non-sufficient for modern times. They nevertheless were intrigued by the historical perseverance and the power that the ulama exerted among the people. And then on the other hand, Motahhari and Talaqani are special in this relationship because they were willing to defy the stark binary that set the clerical class apart in terms of their way of life, their sensibilities and demeanor. So kind of on both terms, there's kind of interesting report here. And Talaqani and Motahhari are really interesting exceptions among the ulama here because they really defy this binary and move towards this audience. And I have a quote from Bazargan which I find really interesting here. He says, "For the late Talaqani, it was not a shame to come and sit down and listen to us when we had a lecture or borrow books from us. This was a highly revolutionary act on his behalf. To consider a hat-wearing Kolahi person a dignified human being and to be willing to hang out with such people. It's not accidental that Talaqani was so much respected and loved. This is because he did not set himself apart from the people." This is not my words. He actually uses these. He did not set himself apart from the people. He lived with the people. He talked in a language that people could understand. He joked with people, ate with people, went to picnics with them. He was just like us, like other people. And of course, people is really interesting category here, right? People means people like Bazargan. Again, parts of this new elite that are emerging, highly educated professionals. It's like he just hung out with us, right? So the same goes with Motahhari. Motahhari kind of falls into the same category. Although Motahhari did not have Talaqani's political and activist profile, and in a sense, he was lucky to have arrived in Tehran right before the coup of 1953, because after that coup, a lot of people like Bazargan, these are religious people, they were on the nationalist front basically, right? After the suppression of the Shah begins, they kind of start orienting their activities. Bazargan in prison famously said, okay, we can't just end up all the time in prison, so we have to start doing some cultural activities, right? Kind of long-term cultural activity to educate the next generation. And this is where Motahhari was really useful, because Motahhari was the man for that kind of project. While Talaqani might have been very much kind of more politically oriented, Motahhari was the man who was really interested in that cultural educational project that the likes of Bazargan started thinking, yeah, we need that to start that. And like an interesting fact about this is like how the, like you have the mushrooming of all these civil religious institutions at the time, right after 1953. It's kind of, you have Anjuman Muhandisin, Anjuman Islami Muhandisin, Anjuman Islami Pezeshkan, Anjuman Islami Muallimin. These are all, they all start after 1953, like in the 5-6 years after that. The Professional Association of Engineers, doctors, teachers, all of this. And then Motahhari basically hangs out with all of these guys. His primary audience in the early years that he was in Tehran was these guys. He goes to their sessions, talks, has discussions. And then I have a quote from one of Ali Akbar Moinfar, who was a founding member of Nehzat Azadi, who was founding member of the Association of Engineers, Muhandisin. He says in an interview, Motahhari participated and lectured in the sessions that were convened by the Islamic Association of Engineers, or physicians, both of them. But his participation was dialogical. The format was not of a speaker speaking, preaching, and others listening. The sessions consisted of discussion, critique, and real challenge. Sometimes they would lead to violence, the way Talabe discussions are famous to turn. Just like the Talabe. So, and the interviewer says, so it was kind of dialectic. Yes, dialectic, discussion, yelling, screaming, all of that was present in the sessions that were convened. Therefore, there was real interaction. There really were two sides. He himself especially respected the Roshanfiqh class. And now it's kind of interesting, he emphasizes just like the Talabe. Like you see this fascination with the Talabe, right? It's kind of, that's what I'm talking about. Like they don't know what to do. Like, this kind of group of people out there. It's kind of, they don't have organic relationship, but they're fascinated, right? So just like the Talabe, we had all those, I don't know if Talabe discussions get violent, that's kind of sounds more like a myth to me, but it gets pretty loud. Anyway, obviously, so Motahhari's most popular and effective writings were conceived in such an environment. While he was deeply steeped in an old tradition of learning, his intellectual courage and curiosity, as well as his social and organizational intelligence, allowed him to make his presence noted and compelling in a variety of social settings that, when not hostile to the tradition he represented, had no organic connection to it either. So it's to some of these writings that I want to kind of turn briefly to, right? So this is kind of I feel like moving in these social spaces is one of the things that Motahhari does best. In kind of variety of social spaces, whether they're secular or religious. And this is a picture of Bazargan with Taliqani and Motahhari. The first book that I want to talk a little bit about is this book, that Motahhari wrote early on. Khorshid din hargaz ghurub nemikonad, or the sun of religion never sets, going back to the eclipse. Only eclipse, no setting. Right? So what is really interesting about this book, if you think about it, is like this was delivered in Danishgah Pahlavi Shiraz. What you think about is like the pinnacle of secular academic snobbery. It's kind of like in Iran. They have created this university. The medium of instruction is like English, no Farsi, no Arabic, nothing. It is the like the ideal vision of university as the Pahlavis kind of imagined it. And then Motahhari gets invited there. It was like the birthday of the Prophet. That's kind of Mawlid al-Nabi. And when he enters, this is one anecdote I've heard or I've read. The students start to giggle because they have never seen someone with that dress enter like such a, and then like the guy who introduces Motahhari, according to this report I read, says, well, I'm paraphrasing. It's like, don't look at his dress. He's actually a smart man. It's like, the balls you have to go somewhere like that. It's like, think about it. It's like, why would you put yourself through that to go to Danishgah Pahlavi Shiraz and but he did that. And a side note, 50 years later, his son wanted to go lecture in the same university, Ali Motahhari, and his son is actually much more conservative than his dad was. And this is what happens with taxi. It's interesting to think about what would have happened to Motahhari was he not assassinated. He basically didn't get to, this is the taxi that was supposed to take Ali to the lecture hall. Anyway, speaking of the balls he had to engage in these kind of things, the other example everybody knows the Zanaruz kind of 1966, 67 kind of contributions that Motahhari had to the journal Zanaruz. And like this is like the page you have on the right is like حرف مخالف چطور, right? Sana Rose is bragging about they have like opened up this free dialogue space with the mukhalif, which is Motahhari. This is exactly when the family protection law is being discussed in the media and in the Senate. So Motahhari comes up like, well, I oppose all of that, but I have my reasons. And they kind of let him publish. And he gets so much backlash because of these. And the reason why I've put this other page on the left, this is kind of, you basically turn the page and there's like, you have this, is like for religious sensibilities, publishing in a periodical like this was like so offensive. Even his closest friends didn't defend it. So like, why would you do that? You're legitimizing this kind of, like the way they talk about women. And we are talking about 1960s, of course, there's a very different context. But he basically said, this is the only way I can reach that audience. And if this is the only way, I'm going to do it. Right? So he didn't really care about what happened to him. So this is another one. Now, another work I'm going to very briefly, and these are kind of, I imagine, expanding on these in like my project. I mean, you can think about the reach that Motahhari had. Like you go from that book to this book, خدمات متقابل اسلام ایران, that was conceived again as a couple of lectures with Anjuman Islami Muhandisin. That's kind of where this kind of conversation starts. Izzatullah Sahabi writes, actually, he wrote a 40-page introduction to this book. It's very clear that kind of this topic has come up in that association, and he talks about this. And then it's published, Shirkat Sahami Intishar, which is a publication house that Bazargan actually established, again, for the purpose of propagating religious, education. And part of this also was some lectures he delivered in Hosseini Ershad, which I'm going to talk a little bit about it later. But it's interesting how Motahhari actually took advantage of any kind of alliance that he could make. If there was a religious person who was willing to work with him, he would work with them. Like Sayyid Hossein Nasr actually took a chapter of this book and translated it into English, appeared in the Cambridge History of Iran. And if you know Sayyid Hossein Nasr is deeply involved with the Pahlavi court, right, through Farah. And Motahhari didn't have qualms about cooperating with Sayyid Hossein Nasr. So he works with him, and they end up, the chapter 14 is, Nasr and Motahhari. This was actually a thing that Nasr did for Motahhari because Danishgah Tehran would not promote Motahhari to the rank of full professor without an English publication. So Nasr said, let me translate this for you, kind of, you publish it together and you will get promoted. Two other works, very briefly. Ad-Ilahi, this is one of the finest, I think, works of theology I've seen from Motahhari, like on the question of theodicy. It was published by Hosseini Ershad. I mean, this is a whole chapter that we need to talk about if we, kind of had time. Hosseini Ershad, this institution that was built by Minachi and Motahhari together as a modern kind of institution to like allow students, university students, to come and like listen to lectures. They did a lot of creative work. This Hosseini Ershad is the place where Iranians actually learn about people like Malcolm X. Who would talk about Malcolm X in Iran? This is where it was. So it was a very creative, original space that was created. And this is kind of, I think, part of what made Motahhari so creative, so effective, like using the social institutions, organizations, to his own advantage, to work with other people, and basically for the stuff that he thought was important. And then, so Hosseini Ershad is something I have to really expand on it in the book project that I want to do. But Mas'ala Hijab is the last book that I want to, I'm kind of, I'm short on time, so I want to talk about Mas'ala Hijab a little bit, because I think this is also an important book that kind of raises some interesting questions about Motahhari. So this book was published in 1969, and it is, Kadivar, Mohsen Kadivar has done immense archival research on this book, interesting, the controversies that it created. The book sold 160,000 copies from 1969 to 1979. I mean, think about the degree, when we are talking about a successful book, especially us academics, right? 160,000 copies when the reading population of Iran in any given year during that decade the age between 15 to 64, people who had high school degrees were less than 5 million people. I mean, this is kind of enormous number if you think about it, right? And it comes again, Anjuman Islami Pezeshkan, right? That's the discussions that are happening in the context of the family protection law that the Pahlavi regime is trying to pass. So the book has two sections. The second section is a really traditional jurisprudence argument. Motahhari said, okay, what are the limits of hijab? And it's the second section that has got so much backlash in Iran. Why? Because he said a simple thing. He said, see, listen, I'm a mujtahid. I believe there is no consensus in Islamic, jurisprudence that women have to cover their face and 2 hands. That's all he said. That hands and face can be exempted from hijab. I mean, it's not a radical thing now if you think about it, but at the time, it was such a storm against Motahhari. He had to appeal to Khomeini. So say something, these are kind of crucifying me. And Khomeini actually did nothing. He said nothing. It's kind of interesting. He left him high and dry. Even though he agreed with him kind of in terms of, just a list of books, this is just 6 of them that were public. Kadivar has kind of gathered information about how many books were written to just refute Motahhari, that no, hijab is not just that, you have to have a niqab, or it's kind of, which, interesting thinking about how now it's kind of such a normal thing. So, but that's not the part of the book I want to talk about. That's kind of the controversial part. The first part is Motahhari's kind of more philosophical take on hijab. That's the part that I find really more interesting for my purposes. So, this first part, he defends hijab in this philosophical part. He defends hijab as a rational provision of Islamic law. That is a divine mandate that has a clear rational basis. To do that, he argues that the question of hijab is ultimately less about women and more about men and whether they should have, quote, the absolute freedom to sexually exploit women or not. And as I'm reading this, just consider this is happening in 1960s in Iran. I have a few minutes just. So, it says, left to their own devices, he says, men have an insatiable desire to seek sexual pleasure and satisfaction from their encounters with women. But says Islam views this to be socially counterproductive tendency, so intends to limit that. So he basically goes on through a very, what would be to our modern progressive sensibilities, very conservative argument. But what he says at the end, he kind of makes a second argument. He says, actually, I believe that this was constituted, this practice of hijab, by women themselves, not by God. And this is kind of interesting. This is like women wanted to protect themselves against men, and this is what they came up. This is a very genius strategy, according to him. And he says this. He said that they took an active role in making. So, he says, his analysis assumes a natural role for women that is to be sexually passive and to be sought after by men, and for men to be active and seek out women. Having realized the fact that they are physically disadvantaged, and this is all his arguments against men, he says women came up with an ingenious double strategy. They took an active role in making their bodies sexually more attractive. At the same time, they devised barriers to limit men's sexual excess. Together, these strategies work not only to protect women against physically stronger men, but more importantly, to increase their social power by elevating their sexual value and desirability. Now, think whatever you want to think about this argument. This is kind of not a contemporary argument. But what he doesn't really say is if this is true, if women came up with this, and if this is about the sexual dynamics, power dynamics. Now, if you have a society in which that power dynamic does not exist anymore, are you supposed to lift hijab? He doesn't really address that, but the implication is very clear. That if this is something made by women, then in a different social context, you should have a different ruling, right? And this is part of what I want to really conclude in terms of Motahhari I have seen him make moves like this in a couple of his books, where he goes to this kind of more naturalistic explanation of religion, but he doesn't follow up its implication. What is the implication if you do this, right? And this is kind of a feature of his work because he was so obsessed and he was so focused on refuting others that he didn't really have time to develop his own framework of, like intellectual framework, as it's said. It was mostly, his works are mostly like refutations, rather than developing a whole framework that would kind of be an alternative. Like the same goes for usul al-falsafa, which I don't have time to talk about. So as I'm thinking about it, as I'm thinking about this Motahhari's legacy, I wonder if one of the most important parts of his legacy was or at least the positive part that I take, is how he instituted a positive and open attitude among the ulama to Western literature. Like if you go to the Hawza after the revolution, there's this enormous openness to translate, to grapple with Western notions, which I think is pretty unique there. And it's mostly, I feel, it's not just Motahhari. Here, you have Beheshti, you have Muhammad Taqi Jafari, all of these kind of pioneers. They established this way of thinking or this way of interaction that, seldom you have seen before in Hawza in Iran. Or, I have less information, but even in, a lot of other seminary contexts, you don't have this kind of attitude of yes, let's just translate, let's just discuss, and that's kind of becomes not part of the curriculum, but it becomes really ancillary to the curriculum of the Hawza to discuss these issues. Like he talks about Kalam Jadid, but Kalam Jadid, he doesn't really say what Kalam Jadid is. He actually took the word from Shibli Nomani, from South Asia, but he kind of gives some ideas. It's like the idea of fitrat is really important. We have to talk about that in Kalam Jadid. The idea of the origins of religion, all of these ideas are important. So he talks about this idea, but never really goes to extensively elaborate on them. So I know I'm running short on time, so I'm gonna end here. I had a few other thoughts that in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over them, but hopefully we can talk a little bit more in Q&A. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
And I promise that we are not going to be that dialectical for the fist fight here. But let me open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Atal.
Let me give you this.
Thank you, Atal. This was wonderful. One of the key points that you make, which I have also encountered in my own work, is the sort of baffled attitude that modern educated people have towards the ulama and towards what goes on in the madrasa and so forth. As scholars, I think, and this is not a criticism of you, obviously, because you've already made this point yourself, so I'm just taking this as a point of departure. I think we need to be much more aware of the degree to which the ulama understand the world, so that it doesn't constantly come as a surprise to us, and we are left with this problem of having to, rethink our categories, which few of us end up rethinking in an adequate way anyway, to understand what one would call the worldliness of the ulama. And the word worldliness sounds pejorative, but it's not. People have made the argument, some scholars of Islamic law, that a key feature of the jurist's way of thinking is their worldliness, their attention to what goes on in the world and bringing that to their reflection upon Islamic law. So my question is, what is the degree to which the mutakallimun, as distinguished from the fuqaha, are worldly people? In a sense, the answer is obvious, I think. They are, because many of their kalam questions are, sort of initiated by the changing world. But I think that it would be good to sort of think about it theoretically as well, of what is the place of this worldliness in the history of kalam, something that has been recognized among the, among the jurists, but less so perhaps among the theologians. And once you see that, some of that element of constantly being surprised by the degree to which they're actually engaged with the world would be toned down. And I say all of this, I hope the point is clear, but I say all of this as a way of contextualizing Motahhari, that he is dialogical, he is quite unusual in the times in which he lived, at least as people are seeing him. But it's unlikely to my mind that he was altogether unusual in that way.
Right.
I think once you start counting the number of people who show that degree of worldliness, maybe not as not with the degree of that degree of boldness, but this would probably be closer to the norm than to the exception.
Yeah, that's a great point. I did notice, as I was doing my research, that like Motahhari is not alone. Like he's working with, I just mentioned, people like Beheshti, Bahonar, even like people like Rafsanjani at the time are kind of speaking that Hosseini Ershad, and then there's like Muhammad Taqi Shariati's dad. And there are lots of people that they're occupying the same kind of realm. But, I think to your point, so he is not that unusual, but then there is something that I'm kind of grappling with, and that is like how much, at least at the time, most of the seminary, because especially like the physical location I think is also important. Like the way Bazargan talks about Talaqani, talks about like he ate with us, he came to picnic with us. Like most of the higher echelon of the Hawza, they are concentrated in Qom, and that physical even distance or kind of separation makes it harder. In a way, like you're right, they are worldly, but like there are some real important barriers or differences in terms of how they are worldly, how these audience see worldliness, right? It's kind of like Bazargan sees worldliness in terms of like, are you going to hang out with us or not? Are you going to take us seriously or not? But I think I take your larger point that this has to be part of a larger picture in which the ulama are not seen as like, oh, Motahhari just kind of dropped out of the blue sky and had no connection to what came or to where he came from. That's true. Yeah. Thank you.
You have time for a quick question.
I take your question and then your question and then the answer, and then you respond.
All right. Thank you so much for the illuminating talk. I'm really glad I came to this lecture, learned a lot about the Eclipse and Mr. Motahhari both. As a person who has actually heard Mr. Motahhari live during his lifetime, I have, I don't know, my generation has a sense that the gentleman was some kind of equal opportunity critique of both the clergy, who's like borderline comatose since the 6th century. That's what he believed. And also the intellectuals who he thought was absolutely flawed representation of the religion, religious tenets of Islam. Misread the whole thing. And to large part, the general public who couldn't tell the difference between the two. So where do you see him, in that sense, that, that said, if all you have is a hammer as a tool, every problem you see is a nail. So, I mean, he was critical of all these segments of the society to some extent. Do you not sense that? I mean, 10 minutes into your talk, you almost said that, without saying it.
Yeah. Well, let me listen from Sharali and then,
Thank you, Atta, for a wonderful talk. Yeah, I was wondering when Motahhari would go to these spaces of the professional class and so on, his own self-imagination of what he was doing, is this a work of moral reform that further reinforces the hierarchy between the ulama and the modernist professional class? Or is it actually a work of an internal criticism where he's actually seeking alliances with a different class of people, etc.? So what was the self-imagination in terms of what he was up to? Maybe it's both as well. And you've mentioned in a conversation that you really want through this project to have Motahhari being seen not just from the perspective of the revolution. You've done a lot of that, but I just thought you could add some of that larger point that you're trying to make about beyond the revolution.
That's a great question, Sharali. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if I may connect, this is, I think it's true, Sharali, that he did see this as his position. He never like it's interesting, even though Ayatollah Burujerdi, for example, is kind of like cut off his stipends, like he never criticized Burujerdi in public. He never kind of broke his ties with the ulama. He was like always committed to furthering the cause of ulama as and that tradition. But at the same time, he was critical of, like one of the most important books that was published in after Burujerdi died was like this Bahsi Darbar Marja'iyat that Motahhari had 2 chapters in it, alongside Talaqani and Bazargan, and it was all about a critique of like how the institution of Marja'iyat, right? It's kind of, so he was a pioneer in critiquing also like this institution needs reform. But I'm inside it, I wish you well, but you need to reform it. So I can't help but think of that, like that engagement. It was not like a direct critique, but it was like, we need to do this more, like we can't just stand on the sideline. Like, again, like thinking about Zanaruz, right? It's kind of like, even though most people criticized him to publish that piece in Zanaruz, so, he was kind of pushing the envelope of like what it means for an alim to actually be in that, be engaged in this kind of modern society. But I have to think a little bit more about like to what extent did he really wanted to exacerbate or further this kind of like the authority of ulama, because I think that's something that didn't occur to me. So I have to kind of think a little bit more about that. But in a way, I mean, going back to your question in terms of like he critiqued both, like that is, I think, one of the parts of his legacy or power of his personality was he didn't really say, okay, like because I'm part of the ulama, I'm not going to critique them, right? It's kind of, or because I'm so and so, or because the only person that I think he didn't really critique at any time was Khomeini. He was I mean, the way he talks about Khomeini is like, you see, like he was like, it's just deep devotion to him, even though Khomeini didn't really reciprocate in a minute. But yeah, so that's kind of, I think, part of like what made him more interesting for people. It's like, oh, here's this guy who actually also thinks there is something wrong with the Marja'iyat institution, because we have to reform that as well. So, thank you.
So much.
Thank you.